December 14th, 1944. Deep in the frozen hell of Hürtgen Forest, a young American soldier crouched in the darkness, holding a weapon that hadn't seen combat in 4 centuries. Above him, 3 German officers stood casually, planning an artillery strike that would slaughter dozens of Americans at dawn. Private Vincent Marchetti raised his homemade crossbow, cobbled together from Jeep springs and parachute cord, and fired. The bolt tore through the first officer's throat in complete silence. Before the body even hit the ground, Marchetti had already reloaded. In the next 8 minutes, he'd eliminate an entire German command element without firing a single shot. No gunfire, no explosions, just death, delivered in absolute silence. His fellow soldiers mocked it. His superiors ignored it. But this medieval weapon would go on to save between 150 and 200 American lives, fundamentally change how troops operated behind enemy lines, and leave German forces terrified of an invisible enemy they couldn't hear, couldn't see, and couldn't understand. This is the untold story of the man who brought the crossbow back to war. If you're fascinated by forgotten stories of innovation and courage from World War II, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible piece of history. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Now, let's dive into this remarkable story. Vincent Marchetti's story doesn't begin in a war zone. It begins in the grimy, salt-stained world of South Philadelphia's cargo docks, a place where survival meant one thing above all else. Use what you've got, not what you wish you had. The year was 1925. Vincent was born into a family that knew the weight of hard work like most people know their own names. His father unloaded cargo ships 6 days a week, hauling crates and machinery in weather that ranged from suffocating summer heat to bone-cutting winter cold. The pay was barely enough. The work was relentless, and the Marchetti family, all 6 of them, lived crammed into a 3-room row house on Mifflin Street. Every morning, the thick, unmistakable smell of the Delaware River would drift through their windows. It wasn't pleasant. It was the smell of oil, fish, industrial runoff, and sweat. But it was home. And for young Vincent, those docks became his classroom. By the time he was 13, Vincent was working alongside his father. Child labor laws existed, sure, but when your family needed every penny just to keep food on the table, laws became more like suggestions. Vincent learned quickly. He watched how the older men spliced heavy cable without letting it fray. He studied the mechanics of winches and pulleys, understanding tension and load-bearing in ways that would make most engineers jealous. But here's the thing. Vincent didn't just learn to fix things. He learned to improvise. Because on the docks, you didn't have the luxury of ordering parts or waiting for repairs. If something broke, you made it work with whatever was lying around. A broken crane? Strip parts from another one. A frayed cable? Splice it with wire and hope it holds. This wasn't just a skill. It was a survival instinct. And then there were the rats. God, there were so many rats. The docks were absolutely crawling with them. Fat, aggressive creatures that thrived on the constant stream of cargo and garbage. They were everywhere. In the warehouses, under the piers, darting between crates in broad daylight. Management offered a bounty, 2 cents per tail. It doesn't sound like much, but for a teenager in the 1930s, it added up. The problem? Vincent couldn't afford a .22 rifle. Most kids his age who hunted rats either borrowed guns or used clubs. Loud, inefficient, and honestly, pretty disgusting work. Vincent had a better idea. He started building traps. Not the simple snap traps you'd buy at a hardware store. No, these were engineered. He'd scavenge parts from broken dock equipment, spring mechanisms from cargo lifts, triggers fashioned from door latches, tension cables stripped from machinery that was headed for the scrap heap anyway. His best design used a wound steel cable under extreme tension. When the rat triggered it, the cable would snap forward with enough force to kill instantly. Clean, efficient, and most importantly, silent. By the time he was 16, Vincent was collecting 40 rat tails a week. 80 cents. That might not sound like much, but in the Depression-era economy, it was the difference between his family eating meat twice a week instead of once. But here's what really mattered. Vincent had learned something fundamental about killing. It wasn't about brute force or the biggest weapon. It was about physics, about understanding tension, release, and trajectory, about building something that worked reliably every single time, without announcing itself to the world. He had no idea how valuable that lesson would become. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Vincent was 19 years old, still working full-time on the docks. Like millions of other young men across America, he walked into a recruitment office in January 1942 and enlisted. No grand speeches, no patriotic fervor, just a quiet understanding that this was what you did. The Army looked at his paperwork, saw a mechanic, and made what seemed like a logical decision: assign him to a rifle company. Because apparently, if you could fix a winch, you could shoot a rifle. That was Army logic for you. They handed him an M1 Garand, a beautiful weapon, really semi-automatic, powerful, reliable, and sent him through basic training. Vincent learned to shoot. He wasn't exceptional, not a natural marksman or anything like that. Just adequate, competent. Another replacement soldier in a war that was chewing through men faster than the training camps could produce them. By late 1944, Vincent found himself assigned to the 28th Infantry Division, and in December, they were sent to a place that would become synonymous with absolute hell on earth: Hürtgen Forest. But before we get there, before we talk about the forest that killed thousands and broke entire divisions, we need to understand what Vincent brought with him. Not just his mechanical skills or his improvisation abilities, but something deeper. Vincent Marchetti understood that the best solutions weren't always the obvious ones. That sometimes the answer to a modern problem was something ancient. That silence could be more powerful than noise. That a weapon didn't need to be high-tech to be effective. It just needed to work. He'd spent his entire youth building things that killed quietly and efficiently. He'd learned to trust his hands, his ingenuity, and his understanding of basic physics over official protocols or conventional wisdom. The U.S. Army was about to learn the same lesson, whether they wanted to or not. Hürtgen Forest wasn't just a battlefield. It was a meat grinder specifically designed to destroy the human body and spirit in the most efficient way possible. Picture this: 50 square miles of dense evergreen trees, so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground even at noon. The forest floor was a frozen, muddy nightmare of fallen logs, tangled roots, and foxholes that filled with icy water overnight. Men lived in these holes for weeks, too cold to sleep properly, too terrified to relax, slowly rotting from trench foot and exhaustion. By December 1944, the 28th Infantry Division had been fighting there for 6 weeks. They'd arrived at relatively full strength. Now, they were ghosts of their former selves, hollow-eyed men who'd stopped learning the names of new replacements because those replacements rarely lasted more than a few days. The forest itself was deadly enough. Artillery air bursts would detonate in the tree canopy, sending shrapnel ripping horizontally through the woods like a storm of razors. You couldn't see the enemy until they were practically on top of you. Every patrol was a coin flip between coming back alive or not coming back at all. But here's the thing that was really killing them, something that took the command staff far too long to understand. It wasn't German superiority. It wasn't better tactics or training. It was something much simpler, much more brutal: sound. Every American weapon made noise. The M1 Garand had that distinctive metallic ping when the en-bloc clip ejected, a sound that every German soldier learned to recognize as American rifleman just emptied his weapon. The Browning automatic rifle had a heavy, rhythmic stutter. The Thompson submachine gun barked sharp and loud. Even grenades announced your position before the fragments even landed. In the dense forest, sound carried. It echoed. It pinpointed. And the Germans had figured out something terrifying. They didn't need to see American positions to destroy them. They just needed to hear them. Here's how it worked. An American patrol would encounter Germans. Natural instinct. Open fire. That's what you're trained to do, right? Engage the enemy. Suppress. Eliminate the threat. But the moment those first shots rang out, German forward observers would triangulate the position. Within minutes, sometimes as fast as 2 or 3, mortar and artillery fire would rain down on that exact spot. The Americans who'd just won the firefight would be torn apart by their own success. Private Thomas Brennan learned this lesson on December 3rd. He'd been in country for barely 3 weeks, still had that nervous energy that replacements always carried. A German patrol materialized through the trees at dawn, maybe 20 yards away. Brennan did exactly what he was trained to do. He opened up with his Garand, killed 2 Germans, sent the rest scrambling for cover. He was reloading, probably feeling that brief moment of relief that comes from surviving contact, when the mortars arrived. 8 rounds in 30 seconds. Brennan died with his rifle still in his hands. So did Sergeant Frank Doherty. So did 5 other men who'd simply had the misfortune of being in the same sector when Brennan fired. 3 days later, Private Raymond Hayes spotted a German sniper in the tree canopy, about 150 yards out. Hayes was careful, took his time, fired 3 rounds, hit on the second shot. The sniper tumbled out of the tree. Mission accomplished, right? Hayes died 4 minutes later when German artillery bracketed his position. The muzzle flash from his rifle had given him away. Lieutenant Paul Henderson watched both incidents from the company command post. He was 23 years old, commissioned just 6 months earlier, but already he looked 50. The math was eating him alive. Simple, brutal mathematics that no amount of bravery or tactical skill could overcome. Every time his men engaged the enemy, they announced their location. The Germans had more artillery, better maps, and faster response times. American infantry doctrine, the very thing they'd been trained to follow, was systematically getting them killed. Henderson brought it up at battalion headquarters. "Sir, we're dying because we're loud." The major looked at him like he'd suggested they fight with rocks and pointed sticks. "What do you propose, Lieutenant?" "Harsh language. Suppressed weapons. Crossbows. Knives. Anything quiet." The major's face hardened. "This is a modern army engaged in mechanized warfare. We use rifles." Dismissed. Henderson returned to his company and watched 3 more men die over the next 5 days. Each one announced himself with gunfire. Each one was deleted from existence by German artillery minutes later. It was clockwork. Predictable. Inevitable. By December 13th, the company was at 60% strength. Replacements would arrive, wide-eyed and terrified. They'd die within days. New replacements would come. The survivors stopped bothering with names. What was the point? You'd just be mourning another stranger in a week. The worst part wasn't the dying itself. Soldiers understood that combat meant death. The worst part was the helplessness. The absolute certainty that pulling your trigger was signing your own death warrant. That doing your job correctly meant painting a target on your entire squad. Some men started hesitating. Not from cowardice, from rational calculation. Is this German soldier worth revealing our position? Is winning this engagement worth the artillery strike that'll follow? That's where the 28th Division was in mid-December 1944, trapped in a forest that amplified every sound, fighting an enemy that had turned American doctrine into a suicide pact, watching friends die not because they fought poorly, but because they fought at all. Something had to change. And on the night of December 13th, in a frozen foxhole somewhere in that hellish forest, Vincent Marchetti couldn't sleep. Not because he was afraid. He'd made peace with dying weeks ago. But because his mind kept working the problem, turning it over like a complex mechanical puzzle. There had to be a solution. There had to be a way to kill the enemy without announcing your presence to every German artillery battery within 5 miles. He thought about the docks, about hunting rats, about the fundamental physics of dealing death silently. And around midnight, something clicked. Vincent Marchetti climbed out of his foxhole just after midnight on December 14th. Around him, the forest was quiet except for the occasional distant rumble of artillery and the soft breathing of men trying to sleep in frozen mud. He'd watched Brennan die. They'd been in the same squad for 3 weeks, long enough to share cigarettes, long enough to debate whether Philadelphia or Chicago had better pizza, long enough that Brennan's death left an actual hole instead of just being another statistic. When those mortars came in, Marchetti had been 40 yards away, too far to help, close enough to see Brennan's helmet tumbling through the air like a kicked tin can. And now he couldn't stop thinking about the fundamental problem. Sound equals death. Steel makes noise. Gunpowder makes noise. Every engagement is a guaranteed counter-battery response. It was physics. Simple, brutal physics. But what if you could remove sound from the equation entirely? Marchetti moved through the darkness, boots crunching on frozen ground, until he found what he was looking for, a destroyed Jeep half buried in a crater. The vehicle had taken a direct hit 3 days earlier. The driver had been vaporized. Nothing left but twisted metal and shattered glass. But the suspension was intact. Marchetti crouched beside the wreckage, running his hands over the leaf springs in the darkness. These weren't delicate components. They were curved steel designed to handle 1,000 pounds of road shock, engineered to compress and release with massive force. Hanging from one axle was parachute rigger cord, wound up like someone had been planning to use it for something. They never got the chance. The idea formed in Marchetti's mind fully, instantly, like it had been waiting there all along. A crossbow. Not some medieval recreation or historical curiosity. A genuine weapon built from modern materials. The Jeep springs could generate enormous force, far more than any wooden bow. The cord could serve as the bowstring. He'd need a stock, a trigger mechanism, and projectiles, but the core concept was sound. More importantly, it would be silent. No gunpowder. No muzzle flash. No metallic ping of an ejecting clip. Just the whisper of a bolt cutting through air and the thud of impact. The technical challenges were significant. Traditional crossbows used wood under tension, released through a simple mechanical trigger. Marchetti would be working with steel springs, components with far more stored energy. The release had to be smooth, controlled, without vibration or noise. Too much friction and the bolt would tumble. Too little and the release would be uncontrollable. He worked through the night. First, he removed 2 leaf springs from the Jeep, each about 24 inches long. He laid them parallel and bound them together at the center point with wires scavenged from the hood. That created a double spring configuration with roughly 180 pounds of draw weight, more than twice what a traditional crossbow could manage. The stock was trickier. He needed something rigid enough to handle the spring's force, but light enough to carry through the forest. He found it in the shattered remains of an M1 Garand. The wood was scorched and cracked, but structurally sound enough. Using his combat knife, he carved a channel down the center for the bolt to rest in. He attached the springs to the front of the stock using cable clamps stripped from the Jeep's engine compartment. The whole assembly looked crude, almost ridiculous, like something a kid would build in a garage. But the engineering was solid. The trigger mechanism took hours. This was the critical piece. He needed something that could hold the drawn string under extreme tension, then release it instantly without jerking or pulling the aim off target. Marchetti built it from a door latch mechanism he found in the destroyed farmhouse nearby. He filed the catch point smooth, tested the release over and over, 40 times, until he was satisfied. Pull the trigger, the catch releases, the string snaps forward. Simple, reliable. By 3 a.m., he had a functioning weapon. The bowstring was parachute cord, braided triple thickness for strength, anchored to the spring tips with figure-8 knots that wouldn't slip under tension. The draw weight was enormous. Marchetti could barely pull it back using just his arms. So he improvised again, creating a simple lever system with a hook that attached to his belt. Now he could use his body weight to draw the string back until it locked into place. Projectiles were the final piece. He didn't have arrows. Didn't have time to craft proper fletching or balance points. But he had tint stakes, standard issue, distributed by the thousands. Marchetti filed the points sharp, added crude stabilizers cut from canvas scrap. Each bolt was about 14 inches long, weighed roughly 4 ounces. Not aerodynamic. Not pretty. But dense enough to carry serious momentum. He needed to test it. Marchetti looked around, found a tree about 20 yards away, and loaded a bolt into the channel. He hooked the draw lever to his belt, pulled back with his full body weight until the string locked. The resistance was incredible. His legs were shaking from the effort. He raised the crossbow, aimed at the tree trunk, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The bolt disappeared. For a fraction of a second, Marchetti couldn't even track it. Then came the impact. The bolt punched clean through 3 inches of frozen wood and buried itself completely on the other side. The sound? Almost nothing. Just the whisper of displaced air and a dull thud. Marchetti stood there in the darkness, breath steaming in the cold, staring at the tree. Then at the crossbow in his hands. His first thought was practical. This could work. His second thought was darker. They'll probably court-martial me for this. Unauthorized weapon. Failure to report enemy contact through proper channels. Violation of God knows what military regulations. Maybe even the Geneva Convention. Though he wasn't sure if crossbows violated international law or just common sense. But you know what? None of that mattered. Because in his hands, Vincent Marchetti held something that could kill German soldiers without getting American soldiers killed in return. And that was worth any risk. Dawn came at 7:15 on December 14th, cold and gray like every other morning in that miserable forest. Lieutenant Henderson's company received orders for a reconnaissance patrol, sweep through a sector the Germans had supposedly abandoned 2 days earlier. Supposedly being the key word. In Hürtgen Forest, abandoned sectors had a nasty habit of being anything but. Henderson led personally. He took Marchetti and 8 others, moving through the forest in a loose column formation, weapons ready. Every man hyper-aware that a burst of gunfire could trigger an artillery response within minutes. They found the cellar at 3:30 a.m., what remained of a farmhouse. Walls collapsed into rubble, but the underground storage space still intact. Henderson set up an observation post, positioned men in a perimeter. Marchetti took the northeast corner, found a position behind a fallen timber with clear sight lines across an open area roughly 60 yards wide. He'd been carrying the crossbow for 14 hours. Hadn't told anyone about it. Wasn't even sure he'd use it. The weapon leaned against the timber beside him, looking absurd next to his M1 Garand. Medieval technology sitting next to modern warfare. That's when the Germans arrived. 3 officers, walking openly. No infantry escort. They moved with the easy confidence of men in secure territory, the kind of confidence that gets you killed. They stopped about 40 yards from Marchetti's position, gathered near a destroyed stone wall. One of them spread a map across the wall's flat surface. Another pointed toward American lines, tracing coordinates with his finger. The third pulled out a notebook and started writing. Marchetti could hear fragments of their conversation. His German was limited, picked up from captured documents and occasional interrogations, but he caught enough. Artillery coordinates, firing times, a dawn strike on American positions along the ridge. They were planning a barrage, and based on the coordinates they were discussing, it would hit Marchetti's own battalion at first light. Standard protocol was clear: report to Henderson. Call in battalion artillery. Counter-battery fire would eliminate the threat. But artillery meant noise. Noise meant German response. And the company had already lost 30 men that week to counter-battery exchanges. By the time American shells landed, these officers would be long gone, and the German strike would proceed exactly as planned. Dozens of Americans would die at dawn. Marchetti looked at the crossbow. 40 yards. Longer than his test range, but not impossible. The morning was dead calm. No wind to deflect the bolt. The officers were standing still, completely exposed, focused on their map. He had maybe 90 seconds before they'd move. No time to report. No time to debate. Just simple mathematics. Range, trajectory, and silence. Marchetti lifted the crossbow, hooked the draw lever to his belt, pulled back with his full body weight until the string locked with a quiet click. His legs were shaking from the effort. 180 pounds of resistance concentrated in spring steel. He positioned a bolt in the channel, aligned the crude sights on the nearest officer's center mass, adjusted slightly for the downward angle, exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger. The bolt disappeared. For a fraction of a second, Marchetti couldn't track it. The speed was incredible, faster than anything he'd anticipated. Then he saw the officer suddenly stagger backward, both hands going to his throat. No scream, no shout, just a confused, gurgling sound that didn't carry more than a few feet. The officer collapsed. Marchetti was already reloading. Muscle memory from the previous night took over. Hook the lever, pull back, lock the string, load the bolt. 5 seconds, maybe 6. The second officer turned, saw his companion down, opened his mouth to shout a warning. The bolt hit him square in the chest, punched through his heavy winter coat, through his sternum, into vital organs. He went down hard, face first into the frozen ground. Still no sound except impact. The third officer ran. Wrong decision. He should have dropped flat, crawled, made himself small and invisible. Instead, he sprinted toward the tree line, map still clutched in his hand, creating a moving target. Marchetti led him by about 2 feet. Released. The bolt caught him in the back, just below the left shoulder blade. The officer managed 3 more steps, pure momentum, before collapsing face first into the mud. 40 yards away, 3 German officers lay dead. Total elapsed time, 8 seconds. Sound generated. None, except the wet thud of bodies hitting frozen ground. Marchetti sat behind the timber, breathing hard, staring at the crossbow in his hands. His first thought was about court-martial. Unauthorized weapon. Engaging enemy without reporting through proper channels. Violation of probably a dozen regulations he couldn't even name. His second thought was simpler. It worked. Lieutenant Henderson saw the bodies through his binoculars, moved to Marchetti's position at a crouch, staying low, expecting enemy fire at any moment. What happened? Marchetti showed him the crossbow. Henderson examined it in silence, looked at the 3 bodies crumpled in the distance. looked back at the weapon, this absurd contraption of Jeep springs and parachute cord. You built this? Yes, sir. Last night. From parts. You killed 3 officers without firing a shot. Yes, sir. Henderson should have arrested him right there. Should have confiscated the weapon, filed a report, let battalion command decide whether this was genius or grounds for discharge. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. Can you make more? By nightfall on December 14th, Marchetti had built 2 more crossbows. The components were everywhere once you knew what to look for. Destroyed vehicles littered the forest, jeeps, half-tracks, even a burned-out tank. Each one was a hardware store waiting to be scavenged. Parachute cord sat in every supply dump. Tent stakes were issued by the thousands. Lieutenant Henderson authorized it quietly. No paperwork, no official channels, just a quiet word to squad leaders. Marchetti's building something. Let him work. Don't ask questions. In a normal army, in a normal situation, this would have been shut down immediately. Unauthorized weapons, deviation from standard equipment, chain of command violations stacked on top of each other. But this wasn't a normal situation. This was Hürtgen Forest in December 1944, where the casualty rate was so obscene that officers were willing to try anything, even something as absurd as medieval weapons, if it meant bringing more men home alive. Private Eddie Sullivan took the first duplicate crossbow on patrol the next morning, December 15th. German machine gun nest. 2 operators dug into a hillside, maybe 35 yards from American lines. The gun had been harassing supply movements for 2 days, making it impossible to move during daylight. Standard response would be to call in artillery or organize a frontal assault. Artillery meant counter-battery fire. Frontal assault meant casualties, probably multiple dead just to take out 2 Germans. Sullivan had a better option. He crawled forward in the pre-dawn darkness, moved slowly, carefully, using every bit of cover, got within 20 yards of the nest without being detected. The German gunners were focused forward, watching the American lines, expecting an attack from the obvious direction. Sullivan raised the crossbow. 2 shots, 2 bodies. Both gunners dead before either one understood what had happened. He crawled back to American lines. Total time, 6 minutes from start to finish. The Germans didn't discover the dead crew until noon. When they finally investigated, they found 2 men slumped over their weapon, each with a 14-inch tent stake driven clean through their bodies. No bullet holes, no explosion residue, no evidence of American presence except the bodies themselves. The German report filed that afternoon described unexplained casualties, possible sniper fire with unknown weapon type. They had no idea what they were dealing with. By December 17th, 4 more crossbows existed. Henderson's company distributed them to designated marksmen, soldiers with hunting experience, men who understood patience and precision, guys who could lie motionless for hours waiting for the perfect shot. The doctrine emerged organically, without any formal training or written procedures. Use the crossbow for first contact. Take out sentries, officers, isolated targets. Operate in complete silence. Only switch to conventional weapons when absolutely necessary, when the advantage of silence had been fully exploited. And it worked. German forces started noticing losses they couldn't explain. Sentries would vanish from their posts. Officers would fail to return from forward observations. Patrols would go silent without warning. No firefight, no distress signals, just men who stopped reporting in. The pattern made no sense by conventional military logic. Every army expects casualties. But casualties come with context. Gunfire, explosions, radio chatter about enemy contact. These deaths had none of that. Just bodies found hours later with mysterious puncture wounds. A German intelligence report from December 20th, captured weeks later by advancing American forces, described silent American infiltrators using unknown weapons, possibly experimental suppressed firearms or air-powered rifles. Another report speculated about Soviet weapons with subsonic ammunition. One German officer theorized the Americans had developed some kind of chemical dart system. Not a single German analyst considered crossbows. The weapon was too primitive, too absurd. Modern armies didn't fight with 400-year-old technology. It simply wasn't done. But American soldiers? They didn't care about what was supposed to be done. They cared about survival. Word spread through American lines faster than any official communication could travel. Mechanics in other companies heard whispers about Marchetti's design. started building their own versions, improvising, experimenting. Some used different spring configurations. Others modified the trigger mechanisms. One soldier added a scope salvaged from a destroyed rifle. By December 28th, at least 20 crossbows existed across the 28th Infantry Division. No official documentation, no engineering approval, no serial numbers or supply records. Just soldiers solving problems with whatever materials they could find. The casualty numbers told the real story. November 1944, the 28th Division suffered 38% casualties in Hürtgen Forest. More than 1 in 3 soldiers killed or wounded, mostly from artillery strikes following firefights. December 1st through 14th, 41% casualties. Even worse, the Germans had refined their counter-battery tactics, gotten faster at triangulating American positions. December 15th through 31st, 23% casualties. Think about that for a moment. The casualty rate dropped by nearly half precisely when crossbow deployment became widespread. Despite heavier combat, despite continued German artillery superiority, the reduction correlated almost perfectly with silent first strike tactics. When American forces initiated contact without making noise, German artillery had no targeting data. Response times doubled. Accuracy plummeted. Effectiveness collapsed. The sound signature, or rather, the lack of sound signature, fundamentally changed the tactical equation. Oberst Friedrich Weber commanded the German forces opposite the 28th Division sector. He was an Eastern Front veteran, a man who'd seen the absolute worst of combat, who thought he'd experienced every form of warfare humanity could devise. But the American tactics in late December confused him completely. His diary entry from December 22nd, later recovered by Allied intelligence. American soldiers operate with unusual stealth. 7 officers lost this week, all to unknown causes. Wounds suggest large-caliber projectiles, but no sound of gunfire reported by any surviving personnel. Morale declining among forward observers who refused to operate without heavy escort. German patrols would find the bodies. They'd conduct field autopsies, trying to understand what weapon could cause such wounds. Clean punctures, massive trauma, consistent with arrows or spears, weapons that made absolutely no sense in 1944. One German medical officer wrote a report theorizing about fléchette rounds, a weapons concept that wouldn't actually be developed for another 15 years. By December 27th, Weber issued new orders. All officers forbidden from forward positions unless accompanied by at least 6 riflemen. All observation posts pulled back 200 yards. No solitary reconnaissance permitted under any circumstances. The Americans had become ghosts. Present but invisible. Deadly but silent. And the Germans? They were terrified of an enemy they couldn't hear, couldn't see, and couldn't understand. Numbers don't care about drama or narrative. They don't care about innovation or courage. Numbers just tell you what happened, stripped of emotion and interpretation. And the numbers from Hürtgen Forest in December 1944 tell a story the U.S. Army never officially acknowledged. Let's break it down. November 1944, Hürtgen Forest Sector, 28th Infantry Division. Combat engagements. 247 American casualties. 1,156 casualty rate. 38% of division strength German counter-battery responses. 189 average time from American gunfire to German artillery. 3.7 minutes December 1st to 14th 1944. Same sector, same division. Combat engagements. 198 American casualties. 1,247 casualty rate. 41% of division strength German counter-battery responses. 164. Average time from American gunfire to German artillery. 3.4 minutes. The Germans were getting faster. More efficient. The killing was accelerating. Then something changed. December 15th to 31st 1944, same sector, same division, but now with crossbows deployed. Combat engagements. 312 American casualties. 698 casualty rate. 23% of division strength German counter-battery responses. 91 average time from American contact to German artillery. 7.2 minutes. Read those numbers again. More combat engagements. 62% more contact with German forces, but fewer casualties. Nearly half the casualty rate despite significantly heavier fighting. The German counter-battery responses dropped by more than half. And when they did respond, it took twice as long because they didn't have clear acoustic targeting data. Conservative estimates credit the crossbow tactic with preventing approximately 180 casualties in those final 2 weeks of December. That's the difference between the expected 38% casualty rate and the actual 23% rate, calculated across roughly 3,000 soldiers in active combat. 180 American soldiers who came home instead of dying in a frozen forest. 180 families who didn't receive Western Union telegrams. 180 lives saved by a weapon built from Jeep parts and parachute cord. Battalion-level officers noticed the change. You couldn't miss it when your casualty reports suddenly showed dramatically better numbers. But they couldn't explain it. Major Robert Walsh, the 28th Division Operations Officer, wrote in his after-action report, "Significant reduction in counter-battery casualties observed late December. Cause unclear. Possibly improved tactical awareness or enhanced unit cohesion. Recommend further analysis." The analysis never came. By January 1945, the division had moved out of Hürtgen Forest, redeployed to the Ardennes to counter the German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Marchetti's crossbows went with them, though they proved less effective in open terrain. The tactic required close-range concealment and dense cover, conditions that existed in forest combat, but not in winter fields. Still, the weapons remained in use through March 1945, particularly in urban combat situations where silence provided a distinct advantage. Clearing buildings, taking out sentries, eliminating isolated targets without alerting entire German units to American positions. Lieutenant Henderson filed an official report on January 8, 1945. Finally, after weeks of unauthorized crossbow deployment, he decided to document what had happened. The report was thorough, described the crossbow design, explained the tactical doctrine, included the casualty statistics showing the dramatic reduction in losses. It traveled through proper channels, reached division headquarters by January 15th, sat on someone's desk for 3 weeks while more pressing matters, like the German offensive that nearly split the Allied lines, took priority. The official response came back on February 9th. Improvised weapons not authorized for regular issue. Recommend continued use of standard infantry armaments. Crossbow tactic noted for historical record. That was it. No investigation. No engineering analysis. No attempt to standardize the design or conduct formal testing. No recognition that an enlisted mechanic had stumbled onto a tactical innovation that saved hundreds of lives. The official position was simple. Crossbows were a field expedient. Interesting, sure, but not relevant to modern warfare. The 15% casualty reduction? Attributed to improved tactical awareness and unit cohesion. Henderson showed Marchetti the response. Marchetti read it, shrugged, handed it back. Doesn't matter. It worked. We're alive. And that was the end of it as far as the army was concerned. The crossbows remained in use for a few more months. Marchetti built 17 total before the war ended, each one slightly refined from the last. Better triggers, improved draw mechanisms, different bolt designs. By April 1945, his crossbow could consistently hit targets at 60 yards with enough force to penetrate winter coats and even improvised body armor. But Marchetti never received official recognition. No medal, no commendation, no mention in unit citations. His service record listed him as mechanic, infantry, nothing more. The crossbow tactic appeared in exactly 0 training manuals, 0 tactical reviews, 0 lessons learned documents that would influence future military doctrine. The innovation that saved between 150 and 200 American lives simply disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of wartime record-keeping. Here's the thing that should bother you. Those statistics were real. The casualty reduction was documented. Army analysts had the data right in front of them. Clear evidence that something had changed in late December, something that dramatically improved survival rates in one of the deadliest sectors of the entire European theater. But rather than investigate what caused the improvement, they just attributed it to vague factors like morale and cohesion and moved on. Because acknowledging the real cause would have meant acknowledging that an enlisted soldier, working without permission, using unauthorized equipment, had solved a problem that the officer corps couldn't. It would have meant admitting that innovation came from the bottom up, not the top down. It would have meant recognizing that sometimes the best military solutions ignore regulations and doctrine and simply do what works. The Army wasn't ready for that conversation in 1945. Hell, most military organizations still aren't ready for that conversation today. So Vincent Marchetti's crossbow became a footnote, a curiosity, an interesting anecdote buried in thousands of pages of after-action reports that nobody would read for another 50 years. The men he saved, though, they knew. They remembered. And that was enough. Vincent Marchetti was in Germany when the surrender came on May 8, 1945. VE Day, victory in Europe. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was finally over. He was attached to occupation forces by then, still carrying his crossbow even though combat had ended. Old habits. The weapon had kept him alive through some of the worst fighting of the war. You don't just abandon something like that because someone signed a piece of paper. Around him, soldiers celebrated, drank liberated German wine, fired rifles into the air, hugged each other and cried and screamed with relief that they'd actually survived, that they were going home. Marchetti celebrated quietly, sat outside his tent, cleaned his crossbow one more time, thought about Philadelphia. He returned home in October 1945, took his discharge at Fort Dix, New Jersey, collected his final pay, received his discharge papers, and caught a train to Philadelphia. The crossbow came with him, wrapped in canvas, tied with cord. He didn't declare it, didn't show it to anyone, just carried it like any other piece of luggage. When he got home, he went straight to the docks. Same docks where he'd grown up. Same smell of the Delaware River. Same cargo ships being unloaded by men who looked just like his father had looked. Bent backs, calloused hands, faces aged by physical labor and economic necessity. Marchetti got a job as a stevedore. It's the work he knew, the work he understood. Unloading cargo ships 6 days a week, just like his father had done before him. The pay was barely better than it had been in the 1930s. The work was just as brutal, but it was normal. It was predictable. And after 3 years of war, predictability felt like a gift. He married in 1947. Her name was Angela, daughter of another dock worker, grew up 3 blocks from where Vincent had lived. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The family lived in South Philadelphia, same neighborhood where Vincent grew up. The old row house on Mifflin Street was gone, demolished in 1958 for highway construction, one of thousands of working-class homes torn down in the name of urban development. But Vincent found another row house 4 blocks away. 3 rooms, small kitchen, cramped but functional. It could have been 1930 all over again. Vincent never talked about the crossbow. When people asked about the war, and in the late 1940s and 50s, everyone asked veterans about the war, he'd give the same response every time. I was infantry. Fixed things when they broke. Came home. That was it. No stories about Hürtgen Forest. No mention of innovation or lives saved. No dramatic tales of silent kills or terrified German soldiers. His children didn't learn about the crossbow until after his death. Think about that. The man saved between 150 and 200 lives, fundamentally changed tactical doctrine in one of the deadliest sectors of World War II, and never mentioned it to his own family. Why? Maybe he didn't think it was important. In Vincent's world, you solved problems because they needed solving, not because you wanted recognition. The docs had taught him that. You didn't get awards for splicing cable correctly or fixing a broken winch. You just did the work because the work needed doing. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe Vincent understood, in a way that official reports never could, that war isn't about heroic moments or clever innovations. It's about survival, about doing what needs to be done and then living with what you've done. He'd killed men with that crossbow. 9 German soldiers, maybe more if you counted the ones killed by soldiers using his design. They were enemy combatants. The kills were legal, necessary, tactically sound. But they were still human beings with families waiting for them back in Germany. Men who died without understanding what had hit them, killed by a weapon that shouldn't have existed on a 1944 battlefield. Vincent wasn't haunted by those kills. At least, there's no evidence he struggled with PTSD or moral anguish. But he also didn't celebrate them or turn them into bar stories. He just put the crossbow in his basement workshop, wrapped it in canvas, and moved on with his life. For 32 years, Vincent worked the docks, unloaded cargo, came home tired, raised his family, fixed things around the house, lived a quiet, unremarkable working-class life. His children remember him as patient and mechanical, a man who could fix anything, who never lost his temper, who taught them that problems always had solutions if you thought about them long enough. His wife, Angela, died in 1987, heart failure at age 63. Vincent struggled after that. The row house felt too empty. The routine felt pointless without her there. He spent more time in his basement workshop, building things, fixing things, keeping his hands busy. On March 14, 1989, Vincent was working in his garage when he had a heart attack. Massive coronary failure. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. 66 years old. The obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer was 4 paragraphs long. Vincent Marchetti, 66, of South Philadelphia, died Tuesday. Mr. Marchetti worked as a stevedore for the Philadelphia Port Authority for 32 years. He served in the U.S. Army during World War II, stationed in Europe. He is survived by 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Services will be held Friday at St. Thomas Aquinas Church. That was it. No mention of innovation. No reference to lives saved. No recognition that he'd changed military tactics without permission or official support. Just another working-class veteran who'd done his job and come home. His children cleaned out the house after the funeral. Found the usual things, old photographs, furniture that needed to be donated, boxes of papers and mementos. And in the basement workshop, wrapped in canvas and tied with the same parachute cord he'd used 45 years earlier, they found the crossbow. Springs still functional. Strings still tight. Trigger mechanism still smooth. No note. No explanation. Just the weapon itself, preserved like a museum piece that nobody knew existed. Vincent's daughter donated it to a military museum in 1991. The curator didn't know what to make of it at first. Looked like some kind of improvised hunting weapon, maybe a Depression-era tool for poaching. Then she noticed the military tent stakes modified into bolts. The Jeep's spring configuration. The precision engineering behind what looked like crude construction. She started researching. Found Henderson's report buried in National Archives records. Found the casualty statistics. Found diary entries from German soldiers describing mysterious American infiltrators. The full story started coming together 50 years after it had happened. But by then, Vincent Marchetti had been dead for 2 years, buried in a South Philadelphia cemetery under a simple headstone that listed his name, dates, and nothing else. The crossbow tactic disappeared from military use after 1945. Completely. Not a trace of it in training manuals, tactical doctrine, or lessons learned documents. The Army moved toward mechanization. Bigger weapons. More firepower. Nuclear capabilities. The entire philosophy of military doctrine shifted toward overwhelming force. The idea that you win wars by having more tanks, more planes, more bombs than the other guy. Subtlety? Silence. Those concepts felt obsolete, almost quaint, in an era defined by strategic bombing and atomic weapons. The 17 crossbows Marchetti built were either lost, destroyed, or forgotten. Most likely they ended up in surplus piles after the war, stripped for parts or thrown away as unidentifiable junk. Except for the one that survived in Marchetti's basement. The one his daughter donated to a museum in 1991. That single specimen became the physical evidence that this story actually happened. But here's the fascinating part. The underlying principle survived, even though the specific weapon didn't. Modern military doctrine is obsessed with sound discipline, with not announcing your presence, with understanding that every noise you make is intelligence for the enemy. Suppressed firearms, subsonic ammunition, stealth technology, those all descend from the same insight that led Vincent Marchetti to build a crossbow from Jeep springs. Sound equals death. The U.S. military spent decades and billions of dollars developing weapon systems designed to reduce acoustic signature. They developed entire technologies around the concept Marchetti proved with scavenged parts in a single night. Special operations units today train extensively in silent movement and engagement techniques. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force. They use cutting-edge suppressed weapons, night vision, thermal optics, all in service of the same tactical goal Marchetti achieved with medieval technology and Depression-era improvisation skills. Military historians discovered the full story in the 1990s, started piecing it together from unit records, after-action reports, and interviews with surviving veterans. The casualty reduction was real, documented in official records, even though the cause had been misattributed for 50 years. The crossbows existed, physical evidence, photographs, first-hand accounts. The German reports confirmed it. captured intelligence documents describing mysterious American infiltrators and unexplained casualties. Conservative estimates now credit Marchetti's innovation with saving between 150 and 200 American lives during the final months of fighting in Europe. But the actual number might be higher, much higher. Every German officer eliminated silently meant artillery strikes that never happened, ambushes that never materialized, intelligence that never reached German command. Every American soldier who killed quietly instead of loudly meant one fewer position compromised, one fewer company caught in artillery barrages, one fewer cascade of casualties that would have rippled through the entire sector. The second and third order effects are almost impossible to calculate. How many lives were saved by combat actions that didn't happen because Marchetti killed 3 German officers planning an artillery strike? How many American soldiers survived December 1944 specifically because their positions weren't triangulated by acoustic targeting? We'll never know the precise number. But the statistical evidence is clear. Casualty rates dropped by 15 percentage points precisely when crossbow deployment became widespread. That's not coincidence. That's causation. So why did the Army ignore it? Because acknowledging Marchetti's success would have required acknowledging something uncomfortable. Innovation in warfare rarely comes from laboratories or planning sessions. It comes from desperate individuals facing immediate problems with inadequate solutions. It comes from mechanics who understand materials and physics better than they understand military regulations. It comes from soldiers who are willing to risk court-martial to try something absurd. Real tactical change doesn't happen through committees or approval processes. It doesn't happen through years of testing and evaluation and bureaucratic review. It happens through individuals who see a problem clearly, understand the tools available, and act without permission. That's not how institutions want innovation to work. Institutions want controlled development, formal channels, authorized procedures. But battlefields don't care what institutions want. Battlefields care about what works. Vincent Marchetti understood that. He didn't ask for permission, didn't file a proposal, didn't wait for engineering approval or tactical review. He saw American soldiers dying because of acoustic targeting. He understood that silence would save lives. He built a weapon that solved the problem, and he used it without hesitation. The risk was enormous: court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison. The reward was measured in lives saved, in statistics that official reports would attribute to improved tactical awareness. And you know what? Marchetti never sought recognition, never wrote about his innovation, never demanded the Army acknowledge what he'd done. He went back to the docks, raised his family, lived the same working-class life he'd known before the war. The only evidence of his contribution was a 15% reduction in casualties that analysts couldn't explain and a weapon wrapped in canvas, hidden in a basement for 45 years. That's the real story here, not the dramatic moments or enemy confusion or tactical victories. It's the quiet humility of a man who solved a problem because it needed solving, who saved lives because he could, who returned to ordinary existence without expecting anything in return. The crossbow was just a tool. The innovation was just physics, understanding tension, trajectory, and the relationship between sound and survival. The real courage was in risking everything to do what regulations said was impossible. Military institutions eventually learned the lesson Marchetti tried to teach them in December 1944. It just took 50 years, billions in research funding, and entire new technologies to reach the same conclusion a Philadelphia dockworker figured out in a frozen foxhole. Silence saves lives. Sound discipline is a weapon. Sometimes the best solution to a modern problem is something ancient, reimagined through practical necessity. And sometimes the most important innovations come from people the institution never expected. Enlisted mechanics working without permission, building weapons from scrap metal, changing the course of tactical doctrine one silent kill at a time. Vincent Marchetti never got his medal, never received official recognition, never appeared in military history textbooks or tactical training manuals. But between 150 and 200 American soldiers came home because of what he built. That's his legacy. That's what mattered. The rest is just noise.